Hey, you missed a spot. A polished leather shoe nudged the wet floor, splashing dirty water back onto the already clean surface. Damn, never thought I'd see a CO scrubbing floors. Someone quipped, smirking. We should take a picture, perfect for the company newsletter. More laughter followed. But the man they mocked didn't laugh. The murmur of idle conversations mixed with the rhythmic tapping of polished shoes against the marble floor. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and expensive cologne lingered in the air, blending into the sterile atmosphere of Kingsman Group, a corporate empire built on power and prestige. But prestige was a mask. Beneath the surface, something rotten festered. The mop glided across the floor, streaking water over an already spotless surface. A moment of quiet, just the soft sound of damp fibers against marble. Then laughter. You missed the spot, janitor. A polished leather shoe, Italian, undoubtedly custom-made, nudged at the wet floor, leaving behind a deliberate smudge. Adam Henderson, clad in a faded blue janitor's uniform, straightened slowly. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he let the words settle, absorbing the familiar undertone of superiority. Mockery disguised as casual observation. Across from him, leaning casually against a sleek mahogany desk, stood Tom Rivers, operations manager, self-proclaimed gatekeeper of corporate excellence, and a man who reveled in his own importance. His arms folded over his broad chest, an amused smirk curling at the edges of his lips. Around them, others watched, some with mild curiosity, others with thinly veiled amusement. A few turned away, choosing the safety of silence over confrontation. Did I say something funny? Adam asked, keeping his voice level, devoid of emotion. Tom's smirk widened. I just think it's cute that you're trying so hard. He turned slightly, addressing the surrounding employees with mock sincerity. Can we just take a moment to appreciate how committed this guy is? I mean, look at that precision. The sheer artistry of mopping floors. Laughter rippled through the small crowd, feeding off his confidence like moths drawn to flame. Adam's grip tightened on the mop handle, knuckles whitening under the pressure. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken hierarchy that governed this place. And yet, he said nothing. Not yet. A woman strode past, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Rebecca Miller, head of human resources. A woman who prided herself on maintaining company standards, a phrase that, in her interpretation, often translated to keeping the right people in power and the wrong people in their place. Her eyes flicked to Adam, impassive, indifferent. She didn't acknowledge him as a person, just a piece of furniture in the grand design of Kingsman Group. We don't need unnecessary distractions, she murmured, barely sparing him a glance before turning to Tom. If he's slowing things down, you know what to do. Tom chuckled, a predator indulging in an easy hunt. You hear that, buddy? No distractions. We wouldn't want to get in the way of real work. Now would we? Another round of laughter. Adam exhaled slowly, inhaling the thick scent of arrogance and self-importance. He had expected this. For weeks, whispers had reached his ears, accounts of power abused, of employees humiliated into compliance, of a culture that thrived on silent submission. From the outside, Kingsman Group was an empire, an untouchable titan of corporate success. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Adam had built this company with his own hands. He had poured years of his life into its foundations, ensuring it stood as a beacon of progress. But empires fall not from external threats, but from internal decay. And he had come to witness that decay firsthand. No title, no status, no privilege, only a name no one recognized, a uniform that rendered him invisible, and a mission that demanded patience. I should get back to work, Adam said simply, forcing himself to move. But Tom wasn't finished. You know what? Let's make it easier for you. Before Adam could react, Tom's hand shot forward, knocking the mop bucket over. A rush of dirty water spilled onto the marble floor, spreading in uneven rivulets. A collective gasp followed, more from entertainment than shock. Tom shrugged, feigning innocence. Guess you'll have to start over. The amusement was palpable. They were enjoying this. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken expectation. Would the janitor snap? Retaliate? Embarrass himself further? But Adam simply stared at the spreading water, calm, collected, unreadable. Then a smile. A slow, knowing smile that flickered across his lips before disappearing, so brief it could have been imagined. Something in his expression made Tom hesitate, just for a fraction of a second. A momentary flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Adam bent down, retrieved the mop, and without another word, began cleaning. The show was over. The audience, satisfied with their entertainment, dispersed. Except for one. A young man, Lucas Brady, mid-level analyst, neither powerful nor powerless. He had remained silent throughout, eyes flickering between Adam and Tom, uncertainty etched into his features. As Adam mopped up the mess, Lucas hesitated before stepping closer, lowering his voice. "Hey, sorry about that. Tom can be..." Adam held up a hand, stopping him. "No need," he said, voice even. "Just doing my job." Lucas hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. But in the end, fear won. He turned, disappearing into the crowd. Adam watched him go, his mind already calculating the next move. Because today, he was a janitor. But tomorrow? Tomorrow, they would all remember his name. The water had dried, but the stain of humiliation lingered in the air long after the spectacle had ended. Kingsman Group was an empire of dominance, and Adam had just been marked as prey. Yet prey that does not run is an anomaly that raises questions. Adam felt their eyes on him as he pushed the mop bucket down the hallway, their hushed murmurs trailing behind him like ghosts of their judgment. But he wasn't concerned about them. Not yet. His mind was already dissecting the structure of this place, its invisible lines of power and submission, its unspoken rules that governed every interaction. There was a natural order here. At the top, the ones who dictated the flow of power, executives, senior managers, people like Tom and Rebecca who decided the worth of others with a glance. Just below them were the loyalists, the ones who upheld a hierarchy in hopes of one day being invited to climb higher. Their laughs were loudest when Tom made his jokes, their eyes sharpest when detecting weakness. Then came the silent observers, employees who neither supported nor opposed, afraid to take sides. They were the majority, drifting wherever the tide of influence pushed them. At the very bottom were the invisible ones, the janitors, the male clerks, the assistants who worked in the background, unseen and unheard unless needed. And somewhere in between, stuck in limbo, was Lucas Brady. Adam had noticed the hesitation in his stance, the discomfort in his voice when he had tried to apologize. A man like Lucas wasn't blind to injustice, but fear of consequence kept his mouth shut. Fear. Adam understood it well. It was the most effective currency in a place like this. The break room was more than just a space for coffee. It was a battlefield of unspoken status. Adam entered unnoticed at first. The employees inside were engaged in quiet conversations, their words woven with corporate jargon and self-importance. Some leaned against the sleek countertops, others perched on bar stools, sipping from overpriced coffee cups. Then someone noticed him. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Voices lowered, glances sharpened, expressions turned guarded. He was a contamination in their world, an unwelcome presence among the self-proclaimed elite. Tom, seated at the center of it all, radiated ease and control. He turned his gaze on Adam, a smirk forming before he even spoke. "The janitor doesn't belong in here." Adam didn't stop. He made his way to the counter, reaching for a cleaning cloth as if unfazed. "Just doing my job," he said evenly. Tom chuckled, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a sliver of annoyance that his words hadn't landed with the desired effect. Silence stretched, tension settling in the air like static before a storm. Then Rebecca Miller spoke, her voice slicing through the room with quiet authority. "Tom's right," she said without looking up from her phone. "Break areas are for employees. We don't want unnecessary distractions." A calculated choice of words. We, employees. Adam was neither. He folded the cloth with deliberate slowness, absorbing the message for what it was, a reminder of his place. Rebecca Miller wasn't loud like Tom. She didn't need to be. Her power lay in her cold efficiency, her ability to erase people without raising her voice. The conversation resumed as if he had already ceased to exist. Adam took his time wiping the countertops, his movements unhurried. Every second spent in that room was a test of endurance, a reminder of what he had come here to see. But then something small, almost insignificant, happened. Lucas Brady, seated at the farthest end of the room, shifted uncomfortably. And he stood up. A simple action. But in a place where compliance was the foundation of survival, even standing up could be a rebellion. Adam noticed. Lucas didn't speak. He merely walked past him, brushing by with a barely perceptible nod, so faint that it could have been imagined. A nod that said, "I see you." It was enough. Adam turned and left, pushing the door open without a backward glance. The game had begun. The next test came sooner than expected. Late afternoon. The office buzzed with activity, reports being finalized, emails sent, conversations murmuring in the background. Adam was cleaning the main corridor, his mind cataloging details, when a pair of footsteps approached with purpose. "Tom, I've got a challenge for you, janitor," he said, stopping just short of stepping into the bucket of water Adam had just placed down. "Let's see how quick you really are." Adam glanced up, expression unreadable. In Tom's hand was a disposable coffee cup, the lid slightly ajar. The realization hit a second too late. Tom tipped the cup over, sending dark liquid splattering across the freshly cleaned floor. Gasps and laughter erupted from a small group of onlookers who had conveniently gathered just in time to witness the moment. Rebecca appeared at the far end of the hall, slowing her pace to watch. "Oops," Tom mused, feigning regret. "I really should be more careful." "Guess that's on you now, huh?" The onlookers waited. Would the janitor flinch? Snap? Retaliate? But Adam simply looked down at the mess, then back up at Tom. For a moment, the world seemed to still. Then he smiled. Not the kind of smile Tom expected. Not one of submission or even discomfort. A knowing smile. The kind that belonged to a man who was playing a game no one else had realized had already begun. Tom's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Adam knelt, picked up the mop, and began cleaning. The laughter lost its momentum, the crowd dissipating, as if suddenly aware that something about this scene was off. Only Tom remained, watching him with narrowed eyes. Adam could feel the scrutiny, the unspoken challenge in the air. Tom didn't like being ignored. And Adam had just made himself unforgettable. The stain was gone. The floor gleamed under the office lights, as pristine as it had been before Tom Rivers' little performance. Yet, the air still carried the aftertaste of humiliation, thick and lingering, as if the spill had left behind something far worse than coffee. Adam straightened, wringing out the mop, his movements calm, deliberate. Control was everything. If there was one thing that separated him from men like Tom, it was discipline. He had spent years mastering the art of patience, knowing when to speak and when to let silence carve its own form of power. This moment, this ridiculous display of ego, was just a test, and he was playing the long game. From his peripheral vision, he caught Lucas Brady standing near the doorway, lingering as if torn between involvement and self-preservation. The younger man's expression was tense, his hands buried deep in his pockets, knuckles subtly whitening. But Lucas said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked away, merging back into the flow of employees who had already dismissed the scene, returning to their desks, their calls, their meticulously crafted facades of professionalism. Rebecca Miller, who had been a silent observer through it all, tapped a manicured nail against her tablet and left as well. There was nothing more to see, and that Adam realized was exactly the problem. In Kingsman Group, this was normal. This was routine. The small humiliations, the carefully curated imbalance of power, it was the foundation on which the entire structure stood. But soon it would start to crack. The day dragged forward, slow but meticulously revealing. Adam watched everything. From the executives in their closed-door meetings, speaking in careful, measured tones, to the junior employees who practically shrank under the weight of an unspoken hierarchy. It was the invisible currency of the corporate world, who was allowed to speak, who was expected to listen, and who was meant to remain unseen entirely. And it didn't take long before the next act in this ongoing performance of power and submission took place. The executive lounge was the crown jewel of Kingsman Group's office space. It wasn't just a break area. It was a privilege, an unspoken sanctuary for those deemed worthy enough to enjoy its luxuries. Polished mahogany tables, imported leather seating, a fully stocked espresso bar with handcrafted lattes made by an on-site barista, and strict, unwritten rules about who was welcome. Adam had no reason to be there, not as far as they were concerned. Yet here he stood, adjusting a cleaning cloth in his hands, pretending to focus on the fingerprints smudged against the glass coffee table. A conversation was unfolding behind him, quiet but dripping with condescension. Tom Rivers perched comfortably on one of the high-backed chairs, legs crossed with effortless arrogance, was speaking to a young woman, and in turn, by the looks of her. She laughed politely at something he said, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed the forced nature of it. Adam didn't need to look to know what was happening. Tom was testing her boundaries. He had seen it before, the carefully veiled compliments, the lingering gazes, the casual, "We should talk outside of work sometime." A game played behind closed doors, where power was leverage and resistance came with consequences. The intern's laughter faded as Tom's voice lowered, saying something that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. A moment passed, then another. Adam kept wiping the glass, his hands slow and methodical, even as his pulse ticked higher. There was a fine line between patience and inaction, and right now he was standing on it. The interruption came not from Adam, but from someone else. "Sir, we have a situation." A sharp voice cut through the air, efficient and clipped. "Rebecca Miller." Tom sighed, clearly irritated, and leaned back in his chair. "A situation. Janitorial staff was supposed to clear out of here an hour ago," Rebecca continued, her gaze sweeping to Adam. "Why is he still here?" All eyes turned. Adam finally straightened, cloth still in hand, and met Rebecca's gaze evenly. "I wasn't aware the lounge had an expiration time," he said, voice smooth, controlled. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze cooling. Tom, sensing an opportunity for amusement, leaned forward. "Maybe he just likes the view." A few chuckles echoed through the room. Rebecca didn't laugh. She just stared at Adam with the same disinterested, clinical precision of someone evaluating a minor inconvenience. "Get back to your assigned floors," she ordered. Dismissal. A power play, designed to remind him of his place. Adam held her gaze for half a second longer than necessary, just enough to make her notice. Then, without another word, he turned and left. But something had shifted. Rebecca didn't like loose ends, and Adam was about to become one. Later that evening, as the office dimmed into its after-hours lull, Adam found himself in a maintenance storage room, replacing supplies, when the door creaked open behind him. Lucas Brady stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Lucas exhaled sharply, stepping inside, glancing once over his shoulder before speaking. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "Rebecca is watching you now." Adam studied him, noting the hesitation, conflicting emotions flashing across his face. Lucas had spent the day watching him, just as Adam had been watching everyone else. And now he was warning him. Adam placed the last bottle of cleaner on the shelf before responding. "Noted." Lucas hesitated again, shifting on his feet. Then, lowering his voice further, he added, "I don't know what your deal is, but you're not like the others." Adam didn't confirm or deny it. Because Lucas wasn't wrong. He was just too close to the truth. And truth, in a place like this, was a dangerous thing. The air inside Kingsman Group had begun to shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Adam could feel it. Suspicion had begun to take root. For days, he had remained an invisible presence, observing, learning, allowing himself to be the target of their silent judgments and open humiliations. But now Rebecca Miller had noticed him. And that meant the game was about to change. The morning was no different from the others, at least on the surface. Employees arrived in waves, clutching overpriced coffees, their conversations blending into a low hum of corporate routine. Adam moved through the halls as he always did, mop in hand, expression unreadable. But as he worked, he felt eyes on him. Rebecca's warning from the previous day hadn't been idle. She was watching. She wasn't the type to act impulsively. No, Rebecca was calculated. She wasn't like Tom, who flaunted his power openly, reveling in his own arrogance. Her control was quieter, deadlier. She was looking for a reason to dig deeper, to question why this particular janitor carried himself with a confidence that didn't quite belong. A mistake was all she needed. By midday, Adam found himself assigned to clean the executive conference room. It was a space that pulsed with wealth and influence. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, the glass so clean it reflected the city's skyline in sharp clarity. The long conference table, crafted from dark oak, gleamed under the recessed lighting. Everything in the room was meticulously placed, exuding an air of exclusivity. And today, it wasn't empty. Rebecca sat at the far end of the table, scrolling through her tablet. Beside her, Tom leaned against the chair, arms crossed, watching Adam with thinly veiled amusement. The room was silent, but the weight of their scrutiny was deafening. Adam knew what this was. Test. Without a word, he walked to the far side of the room and began cleaning the glass partitions. His movements were unhurried, precise, giving them nothing to latch onto. A minute passed, then another. Then Rebecca spoke. "Tell me something," she said, her voice smooth, even. "Where did you work before this?" Adam didn't pause. He had been expecting this. "Small offices." "Nothing like this," he answered, keeping his tone casual. "No references. No prior experience in a company this size." Her words were a statement, not a question. Tom smirked. "Almost like you appeared out of nowhere." The trap was being laid. Rebecca wasn't interested in his cleaning skills. She was studying him, looking for inconsistencies, waiting for a slip that would confirm whatever doubt had begun to fester in her mind. But Adam had spent years in boardrooms like this, reading people just like her. "I go where I find work," he said simply. "That's all." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line, unsatisfied with the answer, but unable to challenge it outright. Tom, however, had no patience for her subtlety. "You ever clean houses?" he asked, his tone laced with something deliberately condescending. "Because, honestly, you look more like the type to fetch drinks than mop floors." A few quiet chuckles sounded from the hallway. Someone had been listening. Adam turned, meeting Tom's gaze for the first time. Not with defiance, not with anger, but with calm, unwavering confidence. Tom was trying to shake him. He was failing. The silence stretched, the power dynamic in the room tilting ever so slightly. And Tom, a man who thrived on control, did not like it. Before he could push further, Rebecca stood, gathering her tablet. "That's enough," she said, more to Tom than to Adam. There was no warmth in her tone, no concern, no reprimand. Only the efficiency of a woman who had what she needed. And what she needed was confirmation. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The afternoon unfolded with its usual rhythm, meetings, hushed conversations, the unbroken tempo of corporate routine. But beneath it all, the tension had thickened. Adam felt it in the way people hesitated before passing him, in the lingering glances from employees who had previously ignored him. Tom was a loudmouth, but Rebecca was a strategist. And she had planted the first seed. Rumors would start. Small ones at first. A janitor who didn't quite fit. A worker who carried himself with too much certainty. And rumors, in a place like this, spread like fire. By early evening, Adam was finishing up in the lower-level offices when Lucas Brady appeared. There was no pretense this time. No hesitation. Lucas shut the door behind him, casting a quick glance toward the empty hallway before speaking. "Rebecca ran a background check on you today." The words weren't surprising. "And?" Adam asked, leaning against the desk. Lucas exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. He looked conflicted. "And nothing. You don't exist." The statement hung in the air. No employment history. No digital footprint that matched the man who now stood in front of him. Rebecca had searched, and she had found a void where a person should be. Lucas shook his head. "She's not going to let this go." Of course she wouldn't. Rebecca wasn't the type to accept uncertainty in her perfectly controlled world, and that made her dangerous. Adam pushed off the desk, rolling his shoulders. "Then I suppose I'll have to give her something to find." Lucas frowned. "You're not worried?" Adam almost smiled. "Lucas," he said quietly, "I've spent my life preparing for people like Rebecca." And she had just stepped into his game. The storm had started. It was not a violent, obvious storm, not yet, but the air inside Kingsman Group had changed. The people who had once ignored Adam now cast furtive glances in his direction. Conversations that had been spoken openly were now delivered in hushed tones when he was near. The unwritten rules of the office hierarchy had been disturbed, and even those who didn't understand why could feel the shift. Rebecca Miller had been digging, and though she had found nothing, her lack of findings only sharpened her suspicions. She was the kind of person who did not accept unknown variables in her world. She would keep pushing until she had an answer. And Adam? Adam was done waiting. Morning came, crisp and sterile. The usual rhythm of corporate life continued. Emails fired off in rapid succession, heels clicking against marble, phones buzzing with urgency that only existed within these walls. Adam moved through it like a shadow, unseen yet deliberately present. Then came the inevitable. Janitor. The voice was sharp, carrying across the floor. Rebecca. She stood near the conference room, arms crossed, waiting. A few employees glanced up, sensing something worth their attention. Tom Rivers, standing nearby, smirked like a man who had already predicted the outcome. Adam took his time walking toward them. Not slow enough to be deliberate, but enough to make it clear he was unaffected. Rebecca didn't waste words. Come with me. It wasn't a request. The HR office was designed to intimidate in the most professional way possible. The large desk, the perfectly aligned folders, the subtle yet deliberate separation between authority and everyone else. Rebecca took her seat, leaving Adam standing. You're an interesting case, she said, flipping open a file. Adam said nothing. No work history before here. No references. No real background at all. She looked up, waiting for a reaction. He gave her none. That's a problem, she continued, leaning back in her chair. You see, Kingsman Group values transparency. We can't have unknown factors in this company. There it was. The real reason he was here. Rebecca didn't care about janitors. She cared about control. And Adam, or rather, his lack of history, was a crack in her perfect structure. He let the silence stretch before responding. I do my job. Rebecca's lips pressed together. She had expected deflection, but not one so simple. People don't just appear out of nowhere, she said, voice steady. So, tell me, Adam, who are you? The office was too quiet. The space between them stretched taut. But Adam smiled. A small, subtle thing, almost imperceptible. And Rebecca saw it. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. Adam didn't break eye contact. You tell me, he said smoothly. For the first time, Rebecca hesitated. And that was all he needed. He turned and walked out, leaving her sitting in the pristine office with more questions than answers. The day continued, but the ripples from that conversation spread further than Rebecca had intended. Rumors began to circulate faster than ever. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why was HR personally investigating a janitor? Small questions turned into theories. Theories turned into whispers. By afternoon, even Tom Rivers seemed agitated. Adam had watched him from across the floor, noting the subtle shifts in his demeanor. Tom was not a man who liked uncertainty, and Rebecca's growing obsession with the janitor was unsettling him. Power, after all, thrived on stability. And right now, stability was cracking. Late evening. The halls had emptied, leaving only the low hum of printers finishing their last jobs, the distant murmur of a few late workers tying up loose ends. Adam stood near the executive break room, wiping down the countertops. He knew this would be the moment. Footsteps. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Purposeful. Tom. He entered like a man who had spent his entire life owning whatever space he walked into. I don't like unanswered questions, he said, voice low. Adam continued wiping, unbothered. I don't answer them, he replied. A pause. Then Tom grabbed a nearby chair and turned it toward him, sitting down like he was settling into a conversation he had already won. You think you're clever, he said, leaning forward. You're not. Adam finally turned to face him. Enlighten me. Tom's smirk was tight, controlled. Forced. You don't belong here. I don't know how you got in, but people like you don't just show up at Kingsman Group unless they want something. Adam tilted his head slightly, considering. Maybe I just needed a job. Tom scoffed. Right. And I'm the Queen of England. The silence stretched between them. What's your endgame, janitor? Tom asked, voice quieter now. For the first time, there was something else in his tone. Not just arrogance. Something closer to uncertainty. And Adam knew. He had him. He leaned in slightly, just enough for the tension to settle, for the weight of the conversation to shift. You'll find out soon enough. And then he walked away, leaving Tom Rivers sitting there for the first time in his life without a comeback. The storm had arrived. Rebecca was hunting for answers. Tom was unraveling, and the employees who had once mocked him now watched him like a puzzle they couldn't solve. Tomorrow? Tomorrow would be the day everything changed. By the time the office filled the next morning, the The shift in energy was undeniable. It was no longer just suspicion, it was anticipation. Rebecca's relentless pursuit of answers had turned Adam from an invisible worker into the center of silent speculation. Employees who had once ignored him now watched him carefully, waiting for something to happen. Something was happening. Tom Rivers had not spoken a word to him since their encounter in the break room. His usual swagger was slightly dimmed, his sharp remarks dulled by something deeper than irritation, unease. Rebecca, on the other hand, was more focused than ever. And Adam? Adam was ready. He kept moving, going through the motions of his routine, but his presence was no longer that of an outsider trying to blend in. Now he was a deliberate anomaly. He let them watch, let them speculate. It was in the smallest details, the way he held himself, the way he responded to their attempts at intimidation. They were beginning to question their assumptions. And doubt, in a place like Kingsman Group, was contagious. By noon, Rebecca made her next move. Adam had just finished wiping down the glass walls of an empty meeting room when he felt her presence before she even spoke. "Follow me." She didn't wait for a response. He followed, aware that every step taken toward the executive wing was being noticed. Rebecca led him through the office, past clusters of employees who pretended not to be watching. The air felt thick, charged, as if everyone sensed they were about to witness something significant. She brought him to her office, closing the door behind them. The space was pristine, modern, calculated, a perfect reflection of its owner. She walked to her desk, placing a neatly bound file in front of her. "I don't like being played," she said, folding her hands. "And I don't like secrets in my company." Adam said nothing. She flipped the file open. A series of blank records, flagged searches, incomplete digital footprints, everything she had pulled in an attempt to verify his background. "Nothing. You don't exist," she stated. Adam met her gaze, his expression calm, unreadable. "That's not true," he said smoothly. "I'm standing right here." Her jaw tightened, frustration flickering behind her professional demeanor. "Who sent you?" she asked. "Are you an investigator? A journalist?" He almost laughed. She was grasping at explanations, trying to fit him into a narrative that made sense. "I clean floors," he said simply. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying him, searching for a crack, a weakness, something to exploit. But Adam had spent years in rooms like this, across tables from people far more ruthless than Rebecca Miller. She wouldn't break him. After a long silence, she exhaled sharply. "You have until the end of the day to explain yourself," she finally said. "Or I make the decision for you." A threat. One that didn't work. Adam stood, nodding once before turning to leave. "Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Rebecca," he said over his shoulder. By the time Adam re-entered the main floor, everyone was waiting. He didn't have to look to know that whispers had already spread, that Rebecca's public summoning of him had only deepened the mystery. And then the final piece fell into place. A sudden buzz of activity rippled through the office. People turned their heads, standing a little straighter. The receptionist's phone rang, her voice momentarily faltering as she answered. Then footsteps. Heavy, purposeful footsteps. And just like that, the atmosphere changed completely. A man entered the office, his presence commanding before he even spoke. Robert Kingsman, the owner. The name behind the empire. Adam hadn't expected him this soon, but it didn't matter. Everything was already in motion. The office fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, movement stilled, all attention focused on the man who had built the empire they stood in. Tom Rivers paled slightly, adjusting his tie. Rebecca straightened, her lips pressing into a firm line. Robert's sharp gaze swept across the room, assessing, calculating. Then he spoke. "Where is he?" The question carried weight, hanging in air. Rebecca cleared her throat. "Who?" "My son." Dead silence. The word sent an immediate shockwave through the office. People exchanged stunned glances, confusion rippling like a slow-burning fuse. And then Robert's gaze locked onto Adam. "Come here." Every head turned. Every pair of eyes landed on the janitor. The janitor who had spent weeks being mocked, ignored, underestimated. The janitor who had allowed them to believe he was nothing. Adam set down the cloth in his hands, took a breath, and walked forward. Each step sent reality crashing down around them. By the time he reached Robert, the truth was already fully formed in their minds. Adam Henderson, the real heir to Kingsman Group. And suddenly, the entire company realized they had been playing the wrong game. Rebecca's face lost its composure for the first time. Tom Rivers looked as though he had been physically struck. And the employees, those who had laughed, ignored, dismissed him, they stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Adam finally stopped beside his father, turning to face them. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of their mistake sink in. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile. And in that moment, everyone understood. They had spent weeks humiliating the man who now held their futures in his hands. And tomorrow they would face the consequences. Silence had weight. It pressed down on the office like an invisible force, thick and suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. They had just watched their entire understanding of Kingsman Group's hierarchy collapse in a single moment. The janitor, the man they had ignored, ridiculed, disrespected, was now standing beside Robert Kingsman, the very man who had built this empire. And the revelation was crushing. Adam felt the eyes on him. Tom Rivers, Rebecca Miller, the employees who had laughed, the ones who had stayed silent, the few who had questioned. Now they all knew the truth. And for the first time, they were the ones who felt small. Robert Kingsman broke the silence. Let's take this to the conference room. The words were calm, but they carried weight. Rebecca barely managed to mask her shock, quickly regaining composure. She nodded stiffly, turning on her heel and leading the way. Tom followed, his movements slower, as if still processing what had just unfolded. The rest of the office remained still. No one dared to breathe too loudly, afraid of what was about to happen behind those closed doors. But they would hear about it soon enough. The conference room was colder than before. Not physically, but in its atmosphere. Rebecca and Tom sat across from Robert and Adam. The table that had once symbolized their authority now felt more like a trial bench. Robert spoke first. I assume you both understand why we're here. Rebecca straightened. Sir, she began, her voice crisp, professional. I had no idea. No, Robert interrupted. His tone wasn't angry. It was disappointed. And that was worse. Rebecca hesitated, the words dying in her throat. Tom, who had spent the last few weeks gloating in his perceived power, now sat stiffly, fingers gripping the arms of his chair. Robert folded his hands on the table, his gaze piercing. What would you have done, he asked slowly, if you had known who he was from the start? Rebecca remained silent. Tom opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because they both knew the answer. They had spent weeks treating Adam like nothing, because they had believed he was nothing. And now that mistake had consequences. The next words came from Adam. I've seen how you run this company. His voice was steady, even. I've seen the way people like me were treated. The ones without power. The ones without titles. His eyes flicked to Rebecca. I watched as you buried issues that made this company look bad. You don't fix problems. You erase them. Rebecca's expression remained composed, but her fingers curled slightly against the table's surface. Then Adam turned his attention to Tom. And you. Tom's posture stiffened. You treated me like I was beneath you. You mocked me. Humiliated me. Why? Tom swallowed. He didn't answer. Because you thought you could. Silence. Adam let the weight of those words settle into the room. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about the entire culture of Kingsman Group. The hierarchy that allowed men like Tom and Rebecca to thrive, while others, those without the right status, the right connections, were left at the bottom, unseen, unheard, disposable. And that was about to change. Robert leaned back in his chair. You built a company that I no longer recognize, he said quietly. For the first time, Rebecca's confidence cracked. Sir, please, she started, but Robert held up a hand. I'm not finished. A pause. Rebecca Miller. Effective immediately, you are removed from your position as head of human resources. The words hit like a physical blow. Rebecca's face paled. Sir, you buried complaints, protected abusers, and contributed to a toxic environment in my company. You didn't think I would find out. You didn't think it mattered. Robert shook his head. Consider your employment terminated. Rebecca sat frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She opened her mouth to protest, but there was nothing to say. She had built this company's policies to serve the powerful, to silence the weak. And now her power was gone. Then Robert turned to Tom. And you? Tom was already sweating. Sirrah, you belittled an employee because you thought he had no worth. You encouraged a culture of cruelty, of elitism. You led by fear, not respect. Robert's expression hardened. I don't tolerate men like you in my company. Tom's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't dare argue. Because there's no argument. You're fired. The finality in Robert's voice was undeniable. Tom, who had spent years believing he was untouchable, had just lost everything. The silence was deafening. Rebecca and Tom sat motionless, the reality of their downfall settling in. And Adam? He finally exhaled. Because this moment was why he had done it. Not for revenge, but for justice. For every person who had walked into Kingsman Group and been dismissed before they even spoke. For the employees who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition. For the ones who had suffered under leaders like Tom and Rebecca. That era was over. As Rebecca and Tom were escorted out of the building, the office watched in stunned silence. People who had once sided with them, laughed at their jokes, played along with their games, now kept their heads down. Because they had all seen what happened when power was abused. And now power belonged to someone else. Adam stepped into his father's office, looking out at the city's skyline. Robert stood beside him, silent for a long moment. Then, you handled that well. Adam smiled slightly. I learned from the best. Robert nodded. It's yours now. Not a question. Not a suggestion. The statement. Kingsman Group had a new leader. And this time, things would be different.